The topic we're going to discuss today is Amalek. Now, um, same rules apply as last time. Anybody who has some answers for some trivia questions along the way,
Chi
just
dovresti?
type it up in the chat. Any good answers get add to an amount of money that would be donating to the Machlis organization, which I mentioned last time. Okay, great. We're going to take a little detour. There are a few stories that we have to know in order to bring everything together. So the first thing that we're going to look at are the roots and the characteristics of this nation called Amalek. Okay. First thing we're going to discuss, though, or first thing I just want to point out to you is a law in the Torah that talks about accepting converts. Now, typically in the Jewish religion, we accept converts, and there are no issues. There are two nations, however, that if they want to convert, and those two nations are the Egyptians or the Idumeans or the Edomites, the children of Esav, essentially. If they want to convert, we don't accept them right away. What has to happen is the person who wants to convert has to come into the Jewish nation and say, I want to convert. We take that person and say, okay, you have to start the process now, but you're not going to be a full-fledged Jew. Your children have to continue on this path for the second generation, and on the third generation, then you'll be accepted. Now, this sounds like a little bit of a racist thing here, but I want to point out that it's actually the same thing by the Jewish people themselves. You see, when the entire world was just one people, and Hashem wanted to choose a people that will represent Him, He started with Abraham. Abraham represents, Chesed and being all out, but not all of Abraham's children were Jewish. Then he had Yitzhak, and only Yitzhak was a monotheistic Jew. And from Yitzhak also, he had two children, and not all of them were Jewish. Only Yaakov was, and from him, all of his children remained Jewish, and that's the way it stayed for generations. So the process that we apply in this law of accepting the third generation is actually the same thing the Jewish people went through. Abraham started this process. He had children, and not all of them were Jewish. Yitzhak continued that process, and then Yaakov continued that process even further. And then the third generation, which was Yaakov, was full-fledged representative of God, and all of his children followed in that path of monotheistic moralism. Now, that's point number one. Story number one we want to address is the following. Yitzhak Avinu marries a woman by the name of Rivka, and Rivka gets pregnant. Rivka has these crazy feelings in her womb because the babies that are in her womb, or the baby, or as far as she knows, she probably only has one baby there. The baby has these crazy fits, according to the Midrash, based on where she is. If she passes a holy place, she feels like the baby wants to come out. She passes an unholy place, an idol-worshipping place, the baby wants to come out. She doesn't know what's going on, so she seeks God. And whoever she seeks, or however she gets the message she is told is that there are two children in your womb, and they're not exactly going to be seeing eye to eye necessarily, but the older will serve the younger, and they will be great nations nonetheless. And so when time comes to give birth, indeed that prophecy was correct. The first one comes out, and he's actually full of hair, and he's red. The Torah says it calls him an admoni, a reddish type of child, and they call this child Esav. Why? Because Esav means done. He's fully done. He's as if he was already fully grown. Most children, they develop their facial hairs later in life. This kid came out with hair all over his face and body. And the next one to come out, which was hanging onto his ankle, was Yaakov. And Yaakov was a simpler, more toned down type of person. That's story number one. But what I want to point out is just the simple stuff. This first child that comes out is hairy and red. Okay? Now, on that point, by the way, the the commentators point out that this redness that it's referring to indicates that this child was going to be a spiller of blood. So let's just keep that in the back of our minds for a moment. The next story we have to point out is the point where these two children, as they grow up, they have an encounter. I'm sure they were counting each other every day, but the Torah felt it important to mention this encounter out of all of them, where Esav comes from the field all tired, and at that time, Yaakov is cooking a stew of lentils, a reddish stew, and Esav says to him, "Pour down that red stew down my throat." And so Yaakov says, "Wait, not so fast. Let's make a deal. You give me your birthright, and I'll give you the stew." And Esav says, "Why do I need this birthright?" They make a deal. He gives the birthright to Yaakov. Yaakov gives him the stew. He eats, he's happy, and he leaves. And it makes a point of saying that he despised the birthright as he left. Now, this looks like a very mundane story, but for some reason the Torah felt that the necessity to tell us this very mundane story. And so the few things that I want to point out, and they're in the bold here, which is essentially that Esav was a very cunning hunter. He was a man of the field. He came from the field all faint, and he felt the urge to swallow down, without even chewing, whatever was in that stew. Okay, so we're going to now just summarize this with the following. Esav is a twin of Yaakov. Esav was very attracted to this world, as indicated by the color red. He despised the spiritual inheritance of the birthright, which was at the time moral monotheism, which was started by Avraham Avinu, his grandfather. Esav is a hunter. Esav is strong and ruddy, and he has a tendency for bloodshed. Esav is prone to thirst and hunger, and perhaps it's logical to say that he'll despise hot climates, with such a characteristic. Now, it's also worthwhile noting that Esav is not identified as red because he was born that way. The Torah actually makes a point of saying that because he took the red stew and gave up his birthright, that's why he's called red. In other words, even though he was born with a particular tendency, which was maybe this attraction to the world, the Torah doesn't consider it engraved in stone, but rather when Esav exercises his free will to choose his tendencies, then it calls him red. Now, there is another point that the commentaries bring out, that one of the things it says about Esav is that he was loved by his father, Kit Said Befiv. Now, but the simple way to understand it is that Esav would go for a hunt, and he'd bring that hunt to his father's mouth, and the father liked it. The other way to understand it is that Esav was deceptive with his mouth. In other words, he would ensnare people with his mouth. In other words, he was a very, very cunning type of person. He was very intelligent. So that's the other way to understand it. Now, we're going to also know, throughout history, we know that Esav hates Yaakov, and they do unfortunately become bitter enemies. And that unfortunately will remain that way for a long time. And the other thing to point out is that Esav has divine roots. In other words, he's the grandson of Avraham Avinu, the son of Yitzchak, and therefore he is exposed to some sort of divinity or spirituality in that home. Now, there are a few things that are worth noting, and that if he was born ready, then perhaps he was destined for evil, but that's not the case. There's an interesting midrash in Shir HaShirim that indicates that just like we say in our prayers, Elokei Avraham and Yitzchak and Elokei Yaakov, we were also meant to say Elokei Esav. In other words, the original plan was that Yaakov and Esav were to have a partnership, that the kings would come from Esav, who's a very practical person and a man of the earth, and the priests and the Kollel people, the learners, were to come from Yaakov. That was the original plan. And there are midrashim that indicate that, for example, Leah was meant to marry Esav, right? These are midrashim that we know. So it didn't turn out that way, but as far as the indications are from this midrash, it wasn't that he was meant for evil. He chose evil, but he had the potential to actually do to actually do much more. and the actual indications are from other sources that his potential may have even been greater than Yaakov's, and we might get to that. Now, if there's anybody who can identify the following place and people, type it into the chat. And somebody goes to Rav Malchus in your name and honor. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay. The place that we're looking at is the catacombs where Rabbi Yehuda the prince is buried. And the people you're looking to on the left and the right are Antoninus Augustus Pius and Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. Now, the story goes that Yehuda the prince, who is the author of the Mishnah, had an incredible relationship with a man by the name of Antoninus. Now, the scholars are not sure whether Antoninus is the one on the left, who is the father, or the one on the right, Marcus Aurelius, who is the son. But these two Caesars, these two Roman leaders, were actually leaders of a peaceful time in Rome's history. As a matter of fact, Marcus Aurelius on the right was a known scholar, and he actually has some very deep reflections in a book. I think can't remember what it's called. Maybe it's called Reflections or something to that effect. Anyway, they had a great relationship. So the commentaries point out that the ideal situation that Yehuda the prince was meant to have, that the ideal situation that Yaakov and Esau were meant to have, actually is reflected by the relationship that Yehuda the prince had with one of these emperors. Again, I'm not sure which one it is, but he's known as Antoninus in the Talmud, and it's a question of which one was it. I'm not sure. So the obvious question is, according to Rashi, was if Esau was destined to serve idols, because he was always pushing to come out at the time that his mother was passing an idol-worshipping place, then how can he be faulted? How can Esau be faulted if his mother, when passing by an idol-worshipping temple, felt these pangs for him to come out? So perhaps we can answer that question with a story from the Talmud. And the story goes that at some point in Jewish history, the sages felt that the pangs for idolatry, or the desire for idolatry, was way too strong, and they prayed to Hashem to expiate, to get rid of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination for idolatry, from the people, because it was way too powerful. Unfortunately, all of the first temple was just riddled with the sin of idolatry. So they got acquiescence from heaven, and when Hashem ridded the world of idolatry, the Talmud says that the prophets saw emerging from the Holy of Holies an image of fiery lions coming out of the temple and into heaven. And when these fiery lions went out from the temple into heaven, idolatry disappeared, and there was no longer idolatry. So the question is, what or why or what connection is there between the sin of idolatry and these fiery lions coming out from the temple? We would think that the place of idolatry, that these fiery lions should be coming out from somewhere else, but instead they're coming from the Holy of Holies in the temple. Why is that? The answer that the sages give is that in order for us to have been worthy of prophecy in the era of prophecy, we needed to have the Yetzer Hara for idol worship. As long as we have that one Yetzer Hara on the one side of the scale, then we can be deserving of prophecy. And when we get rid of the Yetzer Hara for idol worship, then we lose the prophecy as well. So it could very well be, and I think the indications, according to some of my friends that study the Zohar in more depth than I do, or study the Zohar altogether, is that Esav actually had more potential than Yaakov, according to some sources. And because of that level of Yetzer Hara that he had, he also had greater potential in terms of good. Unfortunately, he chose to go to the wrong side. But there are also some sages that point out, for example, the name Esav has the same gematria, the same numerical value as the word shalom, which means peace, and also means completion. In other words, Esav can feel uh, perfect and that he doesn't need anything, or he can bring perfection and bring peace. Right? But instead, he obviously did not choose those paths. Yeah. In contrast, Yaakov is written in the future tense, and he will succeed. But for now, he has to fight and he has to go through challenges, and eventually he'll prevail. But Esav nonetheless had a course of spirituality that was meant for him, and he chose the wrong path. Now I want to bring out another story. The story is when the Shmuel Navi, the prophet Samuel, goes to anoint a second king. Unfortunately, Saul didn't work out. King Saul didn't work out, Shaul Amalek. So Hashem sends him to anoint the second king. The Midrash brings up that when Shmuel goes through the children of Yishai, yeah, there's a person by the name of Yishai in the city of Bethlehem. He tells him, I'm here to anoint one of your children. Yishai brings to him his oldest child, and Shmuel is very impressed. The man is tall stature, strong looking, very handsome, and Hashem says, that's not the one. So he says to Yishai, bring me the next one. And he brings the next one. He says, Hashem says, that's not the one. He goes through 7 children, or perhaps six children. I can't remember if David was the 7th or the 8th. But he goes through all of his children and he says, these are not the ones. Do you have any more? So he says, yeah, I have this young one that's shepherding sheep in the distance. He says, bring me the young one. He brings him the young one. And the Midrash says that Shmuel sees him and he sees this boy is an Admoni. This boy has the same character traits of Esav. And he laments to Hashem and he says, how can you give me someone who's just like Esav? And Hashem says, yeah, he has the same traits of Esav, but this boy has nice eyes. He's going to direct that trait and that warlike nature that Esav has, and he's going to use it, with kindness and gentility. He's going to be my anointed. And so you see from this story that David HaMelech, our very king, the one that's the model for Mashiach, actually has the traits of Esav. Now, I'm saying all this because I want to point out that Esav was not necessarily destined for evil, but he had a high propensity and a high possibility for spirituality and for goodness. And because he didn't choose that path, but rather Yaakov chose that path, so Yaakov ends up having to take the portion of Esav. And so when the time comes that Yitzchak Avinu wants to give a blessing to Esav, his mother Rivka says to Yaakov, it belongs to you now. You took the birthright. Esav rejected it. You have to take Esav's blessing. So what people don't realize is that when Yaakov goes to take Esav's blessing, yeah, he's taking Esav's blessing. There's still another blessing left for Yaakov. For that reason, when the time comes that Yaakov has to return home from the house of Lavan, he has to fight Esav's challenges. He has to fight Esav's angel. Why? Why Esav has to battle his own evil inclination? Why is Jacob battling Esav's angel? The angel that he fought with, according to the sages, was the angel of Esav. Why is Jacob fighting with Esav's angel? And the answer is because Esav wasn't fighting his own angel, so someone has to do that job. And so that's Yaakov. And so Yaakov ends up receiving 2 blessings. Yeah, on the one hand, he receives the blessing of kings, which is on the left, right? That the earth should give all its bounty to you, and specifically that you should also overcome your enemies. That people should, who's jealous of priests? No one's jealous of priests. So that blessing that he should overcome his enemies, that's given to Yaakov because that's the blessing of kings. It was meant for Esav. But Yaakov is the one that has to receive it, and it's the blessing on the left. The blessing on the right is the blessing that Yaakov receives when he leaves his parents on his way to get married. That's the blessing he receives as the progenitor of priests. And that one's that you should continue in the ways of Avraham Avinu, and he should grant you a lot of offspring, and you should eventually have some designated land as well. That's the original blessing intended for Yaakov, and the one on the left is the one intended for Esav. So it makes sense now that when Esav comes in to his father's tent, with the food that the father was asking for, and Esav says, okay, I'm ready for my blessing, Yitzchak says, what do you mean? I just gave the blessing away. And Esav is totally distraught. And you'll see from the language, Esav says to him, Father, have you not one blessing left for me? Bless me too. What's the big deal? Why couldn't Yitzchak bless Esav? The answer is because the blessing that was left was not meant for Esav. He can't give him Yaakov's blessing, right? Well, why can't he just give him just some other blessing? Just make one up. They like people make them up. He couldn't. There was two blessings that were designated here. One for Esav, who was going to be the progenitor of kings, and one for Yaakov, who was going to be the progenitor of priests. And because Yaakov took the one for kings and he has his own for priests, Esav can't get one. So the one that Esav gets is the blessing of a parasite, that you should live off the land. Not that the land should give you its bounty, but rather wherever there is bounty, you should give it. You should be able to nourish from it. Yeah, you'll live by the sword. It's not a blessing which will generate abundance, but rather one wherever abundance exists, you should find it and be able to nourish yourself from it. That's the blessing that Esav is given. So the point here, we've already established the qualities of Esav, and that Esav rejected his spiritual inheritance. Okay, if anybody can recognize this place, write it down, type it down. What we're looking at here is actually a picture of what we believe to be Haran, the place that Yaakov ran away to when he was escaping Esav's wrath. Now, I want to share with you guys two stories that when Yaakov escaped Esav, the well-known story is that he was chased after his nephew, Esav's son, Eliphaz. And Eliphaz catches up with Yaakov, and he says to him on his way to Laban's house, my father sent me to kill you. And according to the story that everyone knows, Yaakov says to him, listen, you don't want to do that because it's murder and it's not right. It's against the law. It's against our monotheistic moral values. So Eliphaz agrees with him. And he says to him, how do I fulfill my father's command on the one hand, and on the other hand, not kill you? So Yaakov says to him, if you take all my belongings down to the clothes on my back, and I'm totally destitute, then according to the Torah, I'm like dead. And you can fulfill your father's command, and it's as if you murdered me as well. So Eliphaz goes with it, and Yaakov is left destitute, and it says that he had to figure out a way to get dressed and find his way to Lavan's house. That's the midrash that everyone knows. The problem with this midrash is that it doesn't make sense, because he knows that he'll feel his father's wrath if he finds out that Yaakov is still alive. So there's another midrash from a source not well known by Rabbi Shlomo Zarka. If anybody knows which country he's from, write it down. And Rabbi Shlomo Zarka says the following story from some sort of ancient midrash, which is not easily found. And he says the following: that Eliphaz catches up to Yaakov Avinu, and he says to him, I've got to kill you. And Yaakov says to him as follows. He says, look, you know very well that Hashem promised that the descendants of Abraham have to spend several hundred years in a land not their own as slaves. If you kill me, then those descendants will be yours. If you leave me alive, I'll take the servitude, and when my children come out of the land of bondage, then you can kill us. So Eliphaz says, you know what? I like it. And Eliphaz lets him go. He relents. Yaakov escapes with his life. That story makes a lot more sense. Now, it turns out Rabbi Shlomo Zarka is from Tunisia. Now, why am I bringing this story up? I want to point out that Eliphaz, who's the child of Esav, also grew up on the lap of Yitzhak Avinu, and therefore Eliphaz also was exposed to the Torah of Abraham and Yitzhak. and for that matter, Yaakov, as long as he was around. And so Eliphaz had a high propensity for spirituality and divinity and kedusha and all the things that Yaakov was capable of. But obviously, he rejected it. Now, when the Jewish people come out of Egypt, they're attacked by a nation called Amalek, and Amalek is one of the children of this boy, of Eliphaz. So he's the grandchild of Esav. The Midrash says that before Esav died, he told Amalek, he charged him to destroy Israel and to succeed Esav in his place. So Amalek then becomes the replacement for Esav in this world, and he perpetuates a legacy of war, of hate and bloodshed, and hate, an undescribable hate for the Jewish people. So therefore, when the Jewish people come out of Mitzrayim and they're in the Sinai desert, they actually have to travel some 400 parasangs. It says here 830 miles, which is the calculation according to the Midrash. But I think it's actually a lot less than that. I think it's more actually like 400 kilometers, if you judge from where it is. Now, who is Amalek as far as the children of Eliphaz goes? So Eliphaz has a wife, a regular wife, but the Midrash says, or the Torah says, that he also marries as a concubine. He takes a woman by the name of Timnah, and Timnah is the daughter of a very wealthy king who owns a lot of land in a place called Seir, which is in the southern mountain parts of Israel. So this girl Timnah is a princess, and the Midrash says that Timnah very badly wanted to be a part of the house of Abraham and Yitzchak, and that she went to Abraham according to the Midrash, and Abraham rejected her. She went to Yitzchak, and Yitzchak rejected her. She went to Yaakov, and Yaakov rejected her. She said, you know what, I'm going to go to Esav. She goes to Esav, she finds his son Eliphaz, and she becomes a concubine. A concubine means she's a half a wife to Eliphaz. And she says, nonetheless, that it's better for me to be a handmaiden by this family than a noblewoman of Seir. So you see that this woman had very high noble intentions. Yeah, a very high noble woman. And this woman with high intentions for spirituality and divinity is the one who is the mother of Amalek, who is the most hated nation, the antithesis of the Jewish people. So you see from here that there are 3 generations of rejection of Hashem, three generations of people who were actually exposed to the highest levels of knowledge of godliness, and they rejected it. So where you have 3 generations of acceptance by Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, you have the opposite by Amalek. You have a rejection by Esav, rejection by his son Eliphaz, and then a rejection by Amalek, who takes over the mantle of Esav. And therefore, when the Jewish people come out of Egypt, Amalek is going way out of their way to battle them in this place called Rephidim, which is at least about 350 or 400 kilometers away. Okay, now if anybody can name this place, do so in the chat. If anybody can name this place, do so in the chat. Okay, what we're looking at is Petra, modern day Petra. If anybody can name the Aramaic name for Petra, do so in the chat. Okay, the Aramaic name for Petra is Rechem. Rechem has a name in Hebrew also, which you'll find in the Bible, which is Kadesh. Kadesh was the capital city of the children of Esav. So it's very likely that the Amalekites came from around this area in order to battle the Jewish people 400 kilometers away in the southern parts of Sinai. So just to point it out where that would be on the map, you can see where it says in red, about halfway up on the right side, Kadesh Barnea. That's where the Amalekites more or less would be, on the right side of that, which is the Jordan. Yeah. Meanwhile, on the left, you'll see Goshen written in red. And the path that the Jewish people would have taken follows those green arrows. Now, this path, by the way, is not what's been the classical Sinai according to Egyptian tourism. Egyptian tourism would have you believe that classical Sinai is in the blue area, where it says classical Sinai. That wouldn't be the case. There's more evidence archaeological evidence that indicates that they went down this path, which is the edge of that desert. They crossed where you see it says the Straits of Tiran. So somewhere in that area is where they crossed the sea. And they end up in what's now modern day Saudi Arabia. And they end up in a place called Refidim, which is very close to a mountain that's called Jabal Alaz, which is where most likely the original Mount Sinai is. And therefore, the Amalekites had to have come from where it says Kadesh Barnea, around that area, more to the right, and had to have traveled all the way from there down to Rephidim, to the Sinai of that day and age, which is some 400 kilometers away, 350, 400 kilometers away. So you see that this nation of Amalek had to go out of their way in order to kill the Jewish people or to battle them. And that's what makes their sin so grievous, according to the eyes, in the eyes of Hashem or in the eyes of the Torah, who says from that point on, these people are against Hashem, and you have to wipe them out according to the Torah commandments. Now, these are all the stories that we have to know in order to put everything together. One more story, and for that, there's this quote here that says, "You must remember that all outward events are the result of either chance or providence." If anybody knows who's the author of that quote, put it down in the chat. The author is actually Marcus Aurelius, who was one of the emperors that we showed earlier on, who had that relationship with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. It's an important quote, because either the quote indicates that anything that happens in the world, either it's directed by God through providence, and if there's no God, it's by chance. This theory, or this way of relating, that's what Amalek believed. Yeah, they rejected divine providence, a life which is guided by God, and instead wanted to stick to the nature of the world, a nature of the world that is devoid of any godliness, where things happen by chance. Why is that important? Because I don't know what it is, maybe 1,000 years later or more, yeah, we have the story of Purim. Now, what was the lot that Haman cast? So in 1845, this black obelisk was found, and this black obelisk, or several of them, came to describe stories of the conquest of Israel by Assyria. Assyria is one of the nations that conquered Israel and exiled the 10 tribes of Israel. So a lot of the stories that happen in the Bible are actually corroborated by these obelisks. The one that we're looking at right here is an obelisk that indicates that the king at the time, Shalmaneser III, in the 30th year of his reign, at the bottom I'm reading, having run through his roster of his assistants, he started over again, as recorded on the black obelisk, and the inscription reads, "In my 31st year, I cast the lot for the second time in front of the gods." In front of the gods of Ashur and Adad. So what was that lot? What did it look like? So archaeology indicates that the lot looked like this. A 6-sided cube, very similar to a dice. So the story is that when Haman casts his lot, he's casting something that looks very much like this. And it's interesting because the Me'am Loez has a fascinating story that actually kind of mirrors this little fact. And he says that the lot that Haman cast were actually dice. Now he gives it a modern spin, and he says that Haman cast these 3 dice, these 3 6-sided cubes, and on each side of the cube had a number, as we know, right? They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. When he casts the dice, he gets the numbers 3 come up, 3 comes up again, and 1 comes up. Now in this picture that you're looking at here, if you flip the 3 around on its opposite side, you'll see a 4 on the right, right? So if 3 and 3 come up, then on the bottom of that 3 is 4 and 4. And at the bottom of the 1 is a 6. So when he flips that around, he sees, okay, I've got 3, 3, 1. And on the opposite side is 4, 4, 6. And according to the Me'am Loez Midrash, he says 3, 3, 1 indicates Aleph, Gimel, Gimel, Agag, which means that the ancestor of Haman was Agag. right? He was the king of the Amalekites, and the king of the Jewish people was 464, David, Dalit Vav Dalit. So Haman was ecstatic. Not only did he get this indication that it's going to be that the sun's going to shine on him, on that fateful day when he wants to wipe out the Jews, but he's specifically going to be on top of the Jews who are represented by David. That's the story based on the Mamluets, and it's interesting that he actually somehow had this tradition that he was casting dice, which is exactly what the archaeology shows. Okay, so now, knowing these stories, we need to point out the following. Everything that now identifies Esav, we can now, transpose that onto Amalek. So Amalek has an attraction for the world. Amalek despises the spiritual inheritance of the birthright of Abraham and Yitzhak. The Amalekites are hunters. The Amalekites now take over that physical redness, I should say, which is a tendency for bloodshed. He is prone to thirst and hunger. Amalek hates Israel. The Amalek share the same divine roots as Israel, right? They have some sort of connection to divinity, even though they're rejecting it. Amalek has a high regard for women, as we see from Timnah, who was a noble woman. And for that matter, when Haman goes home, he's always talking to his wife. He has the perfect relationship with his wife. And he rejected the spiritual legacy of Abraham and Yitzhak. So now, where did Amalek go? As far as ask any scholar, whether it be secular or Jewish, where did they go? And they'll all tell you they disappeared. And for the most part, we accept that anybody who hates the Jews the way, an unexplained hatred for the Jews, very likely has some sort of spiritual Amalekism in him. But the question is, can we actually track it down in a more biological way? So I want to share with you the following story. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany visited Jerusalem sometime in the early, 1900s. And when he came, we have a mitzvah that when a king comes to town or there's a parade, there's actually a mitzvah to see the king and say a bracha. So Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who was the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Jerusalem at the time, of Israel, did not go to see the Kaiser. And people asked him, why didn't you go? So he said, I have a tradition that Germany is Amalek, and I don't want to see the face of a Rasha. That's the story. So now I'm going to share with you what the Talmud says. The Talmud brings up the following midrash. It quotes a verse from Tehillim that says, Hashem, do not give the Rasha, Esav the Rasha, the thoughts. Don't let him pursue the thoughts of his mind. The word that it uses is Al titen le Esav Rasha ma vayeh libo. Do not let him manifest the desires of his heart. Zimamo al tafek yarim usela. Zimamo comes from the word zomamim, edim zomamim. You have witnesses who have bad intentions, but it has a double meaning. Zomem is also, or zamam is also the nose ring that's used in animals like oxen or camels in order to control them. So the double meaning is, don't remove the nose ring from the Amalek from Esav, and the Talmud there says this nose ring, Zog Germania Shel Edom, that is Germania of Edom. Because if you remove the nose ring, Yarum Usela, they will elevate themselves to no end. Now, we're going to get into that for a moment, but I just want to point out the following. Germania Shel Edom is what the Talmud applies to this verse. But if you look earlier, when the Torah starts discussing the descendants of Noah and the origins of nations, it lists the sons of Yefet and says Gomer and Magog. And the Targum Yonatan says by Gomer and Magog that Gomer, who gives birth to Ashkenaz, is actually the progenitor of Germania. And Germania comes from Yefet, according to the Targum Yonatan. So on the one hand, you have Germania coming from Yafet, who's one son of Noah, and Esav comes from another son of Noah, Shem. Those are two distinctly different lines, totally different. You have Germania as one side of the spectrum from Yefet, and on the other side of the spectrum is Esav. They're totally different lines. They cannot mix. They are not the same. There's two different people that have that name. So how do you reconcile that there's a Germania from Esav and a Germania from Yefet? Keep that thought in the back of your mind. I took a look at a website, and the website is the U.S. Foreign Diplomacy Unification of German States. It was a U.S. government website, and it reads the following: Since the days of Julius Caesar, in the 1st century to the 9th century A.D., Rome was engaged in constant battles with the Gauls and the Germanians. Prior to 1803, German-speaking Central Europe included more than 300 political entities. That's written on the U.S. government website. I want to juxtapose that with another statement in the Talmud. And it says in that Talmud, said Rabbi Hama Bar Hanina, there are 300 crown princes of Germania of Edom, and there are 365 chieftains in Rome. Every day these go out to battle against those, and one of them is killed, and they are preoccupied with appointing a new king in his presence. The idea is this: when the sages said that they didn't want Hashem to remove the nose ring, which kept control of the animal, that animal was Germania. And as long as Rome and Germania were engaged in these battles for 9 centuries, then nobody can dominate the world the way they intend to. Germania will not be able to dominate the world the way they intend to. And indeed, if you look up on Wikipedia and you want to just have a quick browse at what kind of wars were engaged between Germania and Rome, over the course of those 9 centuries, 900 years, there was 103 different series of wars. Not 103 wars. There were 103 series of wars, which means some wars had many battles in them. And so this statement of the Talmud is actually very, very telling and corroborated by modern history. Now, it's all going to come together with this figure right here. If anybody knows who this is, write it down in the chat. We're looking at a historian, a Roman historian, who lived in the areas of Germania and England at the time. Now, I'm talking at the turn of the 2 millennia ago, so from 56 AD to 120 AD. His name was Cornelius Tacitus. He was a Roman historian who lived 2,000 years ago, and he lived among the people of that time. And he wrote down what people saw among the Germanians of those prehistoric Germanians 2,000 years ago. And whatever he's going to say is witnessed by the people of that time. It's how they knew the Germanians when they saw them. Okay? Now, I got this from a book called Tacitus. And in that book, it's a very small book called The Agricola and the Germania. Agricola was his father-in-law, which lived in England as a governor. So that's that part. And then there's a section of Germania where he describes the Germanians of that time. Now, with respect to this book and this information that Tacitus brings down from 2,000 years ago, there's a professor, assistant professor, Christopher Krebs, I think from Harvard, who says that this book by Tacitus that described the Germanians of his day became such an influential book among the Nazis. They were so proud of whatever was written in there, and you'll see why shortly, that if you were to speak to any Nazi leader or anybody who had any pride in being German, they would quote off from this book passages that describe the Germanians, the ancient Germanians. So look what he says. This is going to address, I'm going to start bringing down quotes from him. This is going to address the reconciliation of two Germanias. He says the following, that the name Germania is modern and newly introduced. Now he's observing the people that he's calling Germanians at that time. And he says the name of Germania is introduced now to them very recently from the fact that the tribes which first crossed the Rhine, meaning the people who came here first, not the ones I'm with right now, but the ones that were here first, they drove out the Gauls, and those people are now called Tungrians. Those Tungrians were called Germans at the time, but then came this group. Yeah, it was the name of this tribe and not of a race, meaning the ones I'm with right now, that gradually came into general use. And so to begin with, They were all called Germania themselves. They were all called Germania themselves by this self-invented name of Germanians after the conquerors because of the terror it inspired. And so once the name was devised, these people I'm with right now, they adopted it themselves. So just to rephrase that, this man, Cornelius Tacitus, this Roman, is telling us that he's observing a group called Germanians, and he's saying that these people, the name that they have, the name Germania, it's not their original name. They borrowed it from another people who were here first and had that name. But then they adopted this name. The people who had the original name, they're no longer called Germanians, they're called Tungrians. And that would possibly explain how you have Germania from Yefet, and you have Germania from Esav, who's the side of Shem. And the ones that we're going to be looking at and observing are the side of Shem, the side of Esav. Now the next thing he says is as follows. As to the Germanians themselves, I think it probable that they are indigenous, and that very little foreign blood has been introduced either by invasion or by friendly dealings with neighboring peoples. In other words, the people that he's observing are clearly not a people that have been assimilated in any which way possible. They've kept to themselves because they're easily identifiable. And how does he identify them? He says, for my own part, I agree with those who think that the tribes of Germany are free from all taint of intermarriages with foreign nations and remain of pure blood, distinct unlike any other nation. One result of this is that their physical characteristics, insofar as one can generalize about so vast a population, are all the same. They all have fierce blue eyes, red hair, huge frames, fit only for sudden exertion. They are less able to bear laborious work. Heat and thirst they cannot in the least endure, and to cold and hunger their climate and their soil inure them. What he is describing, for some reason, the Torah's description of Esav, which for some reason it felt it had to describe, is exactly how he's describing the Germanians of his day 2,000 years ago. This is divinity according to the Germanians of his day. In their ancient song, their only form of recorded history, the Germanians celebrate an earthborn god called Tuisto. Now, what does Tuisto mean? So I had to look up a commentary on Tacitus, and it says that Tuisto is where the word twist is derived from. Twist, or Tuisto, indicated a double or a fold, yeah, or a twin. In other words, their earthborn god called Tuisto was a twin, and Esav was a twin to Yaakov. The next thing he says, the Germanians, however, do not consider it consistent with their grandeur of celestial beings to confine the gods within walls or to liken them to the form of any human countenance. In other words, all the idol worshiping that's going on around the world at that time didn't penetrate these guys. These guys felt, no, divinity is too great for you to confine it to some idol-looking thing. Yeah, with someone who had a tradition like Amalek, where divinity was exposed to them, perhaps that makes sense. The calendar, according to the Germanians, this is all according to Tacitus. When the moon is either new or full, these they hold are the most auspicious times for embarking on new enterprises. They count not by days like us, but by nights. It is by night that they fix the dates and make appointments. Night is thought to usher in the day. That's exactly the way the Jewish people follow the day. Their days are followed by nights. Sorry, their days are initiated by nights, and in particular, it's a new moon that we mark the month with, and the full moon, which is when our major holidays are, like Pesach and Sukkot, are on the full moons. They transact no public or private business without being armed. The Germanians have no taste for peace, and Amalek was exactly the same way. They attacked Israel without any provocation from Israel. They went out of the way to attack them. Eating and feasting. Feasts and entertainments, which, though inelegant, are plentifully furnished, and that's their only pay. They actually think it tame and stupid to acquire by sweat of toil what they might be able to win through blood and war. And interestingly enough, for some reason, the Tanakh or the prophets felt it necessary to indicate that Esav came in all thirsty and hungry. And for that reason, and for some reason as well, it felt it necessary to indicate that King Ahasuerus and Haman would sit down and feast together all the time. A very mundane and almost inconsequential detail. Why would it tell us this unless it's giving us a description that we will one day have to cross-reference? Germanic woman. The marriage code, however, is strict, and no feature of their morality deserves higher praise. They're almost unique among barbarians in being content with one wife apiece, all of them. Adultery is extremely rare among the ancient Germanians. Good morality, I'm reading towards the end. Good morality is more effective in Germany than good laws elsewhere. In other words, these Amalekites, these Germanians, like the Amalekites, have a high regard for women. Why? Perhaps because the mother of Amalek was of noble descent. And again, noteworthy as well, Haman had a fantastic relationship with his wife. And here's the kicker: divination and the casting of lots. For divination and the casting of lots, they have the highest possible regard. The use of lots is simple. A little bow is lopped off a fruit-bearing tree and cut into small pieces. They are distinguished by certain marks and thrown carelessly and at random over a white garment. The priest then picks up 3 separate pieces and reads the meaning from the marks scored on them. That's exactly what Haman did, according to the Mamloes. He took 3 dice, 3 6-sided cubes, threw them on the ground, and used that to determine what's going to happen with the people he wants to annihilate. Now that's the physical representations of Amalek. Now what about the hatred? So here's some interesting quotes I'm going to just present you with. This is a quote from Hitler. The baby that you're seeing on the left and the little boy on the right is actually him. I didn't want to put his face on here because it says you shouldn't look at Russia's face. But this is a quote straight from Hitler. The Jew introduced Christianity into the ancient world in order to ruin it, reopen the same breach in modern times. This time, taking as his pretext the social question, it's the same sleight of hand as before. Just as Saul was changed to St. Paul, who was the, creator of Christianity, and Mordecai became Karl Marx, the people that is rid of the Jews return spontaneously to the natural order. Interesting how the names that he points out here are the same 2 antagonists of Amalek, right? King Saul was the one who battled Amalek in the days of Samuel, and Mordecai is the one who battled Haman, right, in the days of Purim. Here's a conversation he had with a man by the name of Joseph Hill in 1922. He says, "If I am ever really in power, the destruction of the Jews will be my first and most important job. As soon as I have power, I shall have gallows after gallows erected, for example, in Munich, on the Marienplatz, as many of them as traffic allows. Then the Jews will be hanged one after another, and they will stay hanging until they stink. They will stay hanging as long as hygienically possible. As soon as they are untied, then the next group will follow, and that will continue until the last Jew in Munich is exterminated. Exactly the same procedure will be followed in other cities until Germany is cleansed of the last Jew." This is 1922. This is way before he took power. As Germany was beginning to lose the war, Hitler was willing to sacrifice his war effort on the Eastern Front by sending more trains to pick up Jews from Hungary and exterminate them. And he is quoted as saying on the radio, our war is with the Jews and the Jews alone. The struggle for world domination will be fought entirely between us, Germans and Jews. All else is facade and illusion. Look how serious he was about this idea. Here's another thing. Now, this is a very well known, but I felt I had to include it. What you're looking at is a written Megillah that was written in Poland, 1860. Okay, in that Megillah, you see it across any Megillah today, and I'm just showing you this one because I wanted one old enough that had this to indicate that what I'm going to show you predated the dates listed there. Now, there's 3 small letters in this Megillah by the 10 children of Haman, the 10 sons of Haman. You have a small taf, a small shin, a small zayin, and a big vav. Yeah, that corresponds to the 6th millennia, which is 5,707. Yeah, in 5,707, that's equivalent to the year 1946. And in 1946, 10 Nazi war criminals were tried and eventually hung in October 16th of that year. Now, the interesting thing is this, that the Nazi war criminals were tried earlier in the year, way earlier, and the trial ended in 1946. Sorry, in June of 1946. Now, they had requested amnesty, and therefore they wanted to obviously see if they can get away without being hung. Now, if they would have been hung in June, it could very well be, it would have been that the year would have been Tafshin Vav. But because it's October is around the Rosh Hashanah time, so they were actually hung, in 1946, but in the Jewish year would have turned to 5,707. So because of that little window of time where they were requesting amnesty, it pushed the date to the date that's listed in this Megillah by the sons of Haman. And the 10 sons of Haman had 10 Nazi war criminals that were hung. Now, you see that it's written here that it's 11 Nazis that were tried. So what happened? What happened to that one Nazi? So there's a midrash that says the following: that when Haman was leading Mordechai on a horse, right? It's a well-known story. We won't get into the details of the before, but the midrash says that Haman had a daughter who looked at from a high balcony, looked down and saw one man leading another on a horse. So she took her chamber pot, which is where she defecated in, and she figured the one leading the horse must be Mordechai, and she empties out her chamber pot on the man leading the horse. When the feces falls on him, the man looks up and she sees that it's her father that's leading the horse, and Haman and Mordechai, so her father Haman leading the horse, and Mordechai sitting on the horse. When she sees that, she commits suicide and jumps off the balcony and kills herself. So the person, that 11th Nazi war criminal, his name was Goering. And this fellow Goering was a very, very, according to the rumors, he was a cross-dresser, which means he felt that he more identified with women. Whether that's true or not might be irrelevant, but certainly he was very, very flamboyant. Yeah, there's no evidence presented. It's just rumor that he was a cross-dresser, but he was certainly flamboyant. And how did he not hang with the rest of his Nazi brothers? He had swallowed a cyanide pill that he defecated when he was in jail, and he took the cyanide pill out from the toilet in order to kill himself in jail. In other words, this 11th Nazi war criminal corresponded to that daughter of Haman that killed herself through her own, or on account of her own feces. And this fellow represented or paralleled this daughter. As they were being hung, Julius Streicher was the first one to be hung. He was the editor of a newspaper called Der Strömer. And as he gets hung, he whips himself around, and before he dies, he yells out, "Purim Fest 1946. These people knew more about themselves than we give them credit for. Now that's the story of Germany. And it could very well be that maybe because they sunk so low that perhaps they're cleansed of that hatred, and we hope they are. But the story is not over. There is something left to Amalek until today, unfortunately. And the Zohar brings it down as the mixed multitude. One quote I'm going to bring you is from a book of Midrashim called Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. And there it says that when Sennacherib came to the land, Sennacherib came from Assyria, and he's the one that exiled the 10 tribes. All the nations who were in the region and around about the land of Israel saw the camp of Sennacherib and feared greatly, and every man fled from his place. They, Amalek, went into the wilderness and intermixed with the children of Ishmael, and all of them were composed of 10 peoples, as it is said, the tents of Edom and Ishmaelites. It's quoting a pasuk here from Tehillim, Moab and Hagrians, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia, and the inhabitants of Tyre, Assyria is also joined with them. So it turns out, according to this midrash, that there's also an offshoot of Amalek that becomes hybrid with Ishmael. And it's no surprise that there's raving anti-Semites or Jew-hating Arab countries that surround us, whether it be the Palestinians or the Iranians, that hate us with such hatred. So it could very well be that these people also are offsprings of Amalek. Here's a quote from Mahmoud al-Zahar. He's the co-founder of Hamas. Removing the Jews from the land they occupied in 1948 is an immutable principle. I am not prepared to accept just Gaza. our position is Palestine in its entirety and not a grain of soil less. The Quran says, kill them wherever you may find them. Allah did not define the 1967 borders or the 1948 borders. We will fight them wherever we can, on the ground, underground, and if we have airplanes, we will fight them from the skies. Gog and Magog. Gog and Magog, we get some of the commentaries indicate that Gog comes from the same name as Agag, which also was an Amalekite. Gog and Magog, when you add them up, equals 70. Indicating that when the time comes for the war of Gog and Magog, all the nations will be involved. And it's no surprise that when all the nations get together in one of the biggest anti-Semitic clubs in the world called the United Nations, all they can do is bash Israel. They have nothing else to do, even though there are war crimes going on in other parts of the world. Amalek is also called in the Torah the heads of nations. So one of the things that also could very well be is that the Amalekites could very well be the leaders of other nations. And there's actually a spot in the Talmud that indicates that if someone wants to rise to leadership, if they're Jew hating, they'll rise. And funny enough, I just heard today that they got rid of a Republican in Congress who was part of the I think the Foreign Affairs Committee, because they said that she was a white supremacist. And who did they put in her place? A congresswoman who's very known for anti-Semitic tropes. That was just today. So the Talmud says, you want to rise up? Yeah, if you rise up and you have intentions to persecute the Jews, you'll rise up faster. It's shocking that it says that, but unfortunately it says that, and you can see that it's even around today. There's 200 congressmen that you could have chosen as to take over this position, and they chose the one that is outwardly very anti-Semitic. We're almost done. Sorry. Now, the unfortunate thing is that the Zohar brings down that Amalek might even now exist within the Jewish people themselves. And it brings down in the Zohar, and it's explained by the Vilna Gaon, that there are 5 types of Erev Rav among the Jews. One of them are Nephilim. Those are people who seek lust. One are called Giborim. Those are people who seek honor. And these are people who even build synagogues, donating Sefer Torah. One are called Anakim. Those are people who ridicule Torah scholars. One type of Jew is called Rephaim. Those are who slack off from doing kindness and charity. And there's a 5th category of Erev Rav among Jews called the Amalekim. And those are at the heads of the nation, and those are the ones that take advantage of poorer Jews. Now, the Rashi Tevot, the acronym of these 5 groups, is called Nega Ra, which is a bad plague, I guess. So it's even within the Jewish people themselves, unfortunately, we have elements of Amalek. But we are also in a good place. I want to point out in this picture, you have Heinrich Himmler, who's sitting from the right, wearing the glasses. And on the left, you have a fellow by the name of Arthur Wolschlager. Now, Arthur Wolschlager has a son, Bern Wolschlager. He's on the right with his family. He's a convert to Judaism. On the left, you have Rabbi Dr. Aaron Shar Yashuv, but he was formerly known as Wolfgang Schmidt. He's the son of a Nazi Waffen SS soldier. Yeah, why are we accepting Amalekites or Germanians? Because actually the Torah says, the Talmud says, that the grandsons of Haman were learning Torah in Bnei Brak. In other words, the grandsons of Haman also converted to Judaism. So I don't want to suggest that the mitzvah to destroy Amalek still applies today in the way that it used to by the days of Saul, but rather we can fight Amalek, or we can exterminate Amalek, not with war, but by perhaps just lighting up a little bit of light in your own souls. There's an internal Amalek within all of us. If you dispel the darkness within, then perhaps we can dispel the darkness that surrounds us. Like it says by a Chinese proverb, it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. I want to thank you all for your attention this last hour. I think it went a little bit longer, but I hope we learned something. I had to just run through the last clips because I didn't want to drag it on for too long. But always open to questions. You all know me. You can reach out anytime. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.